Son, and Holy Spirit. Please be seated. The time of year when some of us are beginning to anticipate receiving a tax return check, maybe thinking about how we're going to spend that, maybe apply a little bit to some debt, maybe put some away for saving up for some kind of bigger purchase, and maybe just a little bit of it as some sort of treat for ourselves, some sort of indulgence. There was an article in the New York Times on Wednesday titled "Spend Money Where You Spend the Most Time," which gave some thoughts about how to make sure that that money you spend on yourself gives you the most enjoyment. The author recounts having bought several months ago an ugly but very comfortable chair for his office, he works from home, for $160, and a video game, Super Mario Party, for $60. He says that over the last 3 months he's played Super Mario Party maybe about a dozen times, sometimes with friends, sometimes by himself. He figures he's played the game for a total of about 20 hours, and so he worked it out, and that's $3 and change per hour he spent playing the game. Not so bad for entertainment, cheaper than going to a movie. The chair, on the other hand, since he works from home, he has sat in 5 days a week for at least 8 hours a day. And if he works that one out, and it turns out the chair has cost him about 23 cents an hour. He's really getting his money's worth out of that very comfortable but ugly chair, not as much out of the video game. So he suggests thinking about when you spend money, how much it's going to cost you per hour of enjoyment. Another bit of advice. Think about where you spend your time. The Department of Labor tracks such statistics and says that most of us sleep somewhere a little under 8 hours a night, spend about less than 8 hours a night in bed. We spend, if we're still working, 8.5 to 9 hours a day at work. And most of us have something like 3 hours of leisure time. So he said it probably makes sense then to spend the money on yourself, to indulge yourself in the places, in the activities that you're spending the most time. So if you work at a desk, buying a comfortable chair probably makes sense. If you work standing up, buying a good, comfortable pair of shoes might be a good idea, something that you would enjoy, get the most satisfaction out of. Similarly, spend money on your bed where you're going to spend all this time. If you can't afford a mattress, at least a good pillow can really increase the quality of your sleep time. And finally, the one that really appealed to me says, think about how you can spend your money to buy back time. If you only have 3 hours of leisure time a day, you don't really want to be spending that doing chores. So think about whether it makes sense to buy one of those Roombas that will vacuum for you. I love this idea. I'm not really big on vacuum cleaning. I've always thought Roombas were kind of cute, so I may look into that for myself. I heard in this article an invitation to try and align your needs and your resources so that you can live the life that you most want to, so that you can live a life that is fulfilling as it can be. In this morning's reading from Luke, the story that we just heard about Jesus calling Simon Peter and James and John to be his first disciples, I hear the same thing. I hear Jesus calling Simon Peter to align his needs, what he brings to this life, and his priorities into one. And that's how Simon Peter decides to follow Jesus, to go become a catcher of people. This story follows right on the heels of the 2 stories we heard over the last 2 weeks. You'll remember this kind of disastrous trip that Jesus makes back to his hometown where he grew up. He made sort of a reputation for himself as a preacher out of the countryside. He decides to go home to the synagogue where he was raised. Everyone shows up to hear him preach. He does. They don't like what he had to say. They don't like it so much, in fact, they try and throw him off a cliff. He manages to escape that, and he finds himself on the shores of Lake Gennesaret. And he's preaching to a crowd, and I don't know whether he's worried that the same thing's going to happen. He's going to upset the crowd, so he wants a little distance between himself and them, or whether he thinks people will be able to see and hear him better. But he gets in Simon Peter's boat, he has Simon Peter row him out into the shallow water, and he preaches from from there. And when he's done preaching, he tells Simon Peter to row out into the deep water and throw out his nets. Now Simon Peter and James and John have just spent all night fishing. They've caught nothing. They're exhausted. They've been working to get their nets cleaned up so they can put them away and go home and get some sleep. But Simon Peter doesn't want to argue with Jesus, and so he does what Jesus says. They row out into the middle of the lake. Simon Peter casts out the nets, and they are so full of fish that Simon Peter can't haul it in by himself. He has to call to James and John in the other boat. And the net has so many fish, they filled both boats, and the boats are beginning to sink. And Simon Peter knows something has happened here. He's been a fisherman his whole life. He's a fisherman because his father was a fisherman and his father before him. This is the life that Simon Peter knows. Same with James and John. And none of them ever, in all of their lives, in all the stories they heard from their father, and all the stories they heard from their grandfather, none of them have ever heard about a catch of fish this big. A catch of fish that filled two boats to the point of sinking. Simon Peter doesn't really know what to make of it. He falls down on his knees. He tells Jesus not to touch him because he is a miserable sinner. And Jesus says to him, "Don't be afraid." And when has that ever helped anybody? Don't be afraid, Jesus says. And then he makes this outlandish, out-of-the-blue invitation. He says, "Come, follow me, and you will be catching people." I can't imagine what was going through Simon Peter's head or James and John's head when they heard that. All they've ever known is how to be fishermen. That's how they put food on the table for their family, to keep a roof over their families' heads. And Jesus comes out of the blue and asks them, tells them to follow him, and he will teach them how to catch people. But something deep down inside of them wakes up. And here's what Jesus says, and realizes that in some non-rational, non-logical way, that this makes sense. That this was what they were put on this earth to do. That this was what God was calling them to do. So they drop their nets and they follow Jesus. I hear this invitation to Simon Peter and James and John as an invitation to us as well. To lay down whatever we're doing and follow Jesus and learn how to catch people. And that may feel like uncomfortable language to you. I feel a little uncomfortable myself. We don't like to think about catching people or ensnaring people, trapping people. And I don't think that's what Jesus is talking about. We're also not really big as Episcopalians on evangelism, right? We don't really love talking about our faith to strangers or even to friends. But I think there's some things that we can do that are maybe start out within our comfort zone and grow from there. The first thing is to remember that being a Christian doesn't end at 11:30 when we leave this building. It continues throughout the week. It continues in our workplace, it continues in our homes, it continues to wherever we hang out with our family and friends. One of the ways that we can catch people is by being a good example, by living fully into our calling to be children of God. And that doesn't just happen here, it happens throughout our lives. That's probably the easiest, most comfortable way for us to be catchers of people. The next way takes a little more risk, takes a little more courage, and that is by using our words. When we see people being bullied, when we see people being ostracized, when we hear people making racist or sexist jokes, we can use our words to call people out on that. Remind them that they are children of God as well, and that they are called to live as children of God. We can even use our words to share the good news, to share the good news of what we have received in our lives of faith, to share the good news of what we have discovered it means to be children of God ourselves. The final thing I take from this story is that we are not sent out to catch only those people that look like us, or that we like, or that we think would fit in here. We are sent out to cast our nets wide, to to try and catch people who don't look like us, who don't think like us, who we disagree with, who we may not even like very much. The call of God to catch people doesn't apply just to a select few. It applies to everybody. Now, maybe this doesn't sound like such good news to you today. Maybe you're still feeling a little funny, a little pit in your stomach. Maybe you're even a little afraid, like Simon Peter was. I'll tell you what Jesus said, don't be afraid. I know that doesn't do any good. But the good news is that you have everything you need to do this work. God has called you. God has equipped you. Jesus will go with you to be catchers of people. Amen.